Hi everybody, this is Wanda and I just wanted to say welcome to this week's episode of Bible Briefs. I know you're here for the story, so let's get right into it. So Samuel had become an old man, and his sons were corrupt and unjust. The people came to Samuel and asked him to give them a king, like all the other nations had. Samuel was saddened by this, but when he talked to God, God said, "It's me they're rejecting, not you. They've continually rejected me since I brought them out of Egypt. Do what they want, but first warn them what it will be like to have a king." So Samuel calls the people together and tells them that a king will take their children to work and fight for him. He'll take the best of their land and harvests and livestock for himself and his buddies. Eventually, they will beg God for relief from the king that they're now demanding, and God won't help them then. But the people still insisted on a king. So one day, a man named Saul came to see Samuel, and all Saul wanted was some supernatural help in locating some lost donkeys he'd already spent several days searching for. But when Samuel saw him, God spoke to Samuel and said, "This is the man I've chosen to be king." So Samuel invited Saul to dine with him that evening and told him that the donkeys had been found and that he and his family were very important to all Israel. Saul was confused and protested, "Why would you say that? We're the least of the least in Israel." But Samuel brought Saul to the dinner he was attending and treated Saul as the guest of honor. The next day, Samuel accompanied Saul to the edge of town to send him on his way. There he poured oil over Saul and told him that God had chosen him to rule over Israel. And then Samuel told Saul about several things that would happen to him later that day as signs, the last one being that God's Spirit would come upon him and he would be changed to a different person. Shortly thereafter, Samuel called all the people together again. He told them that they were rejecting God's leadership by choosing a king and had them present themselves by tribes and clans so God could reveal his chosen king by drawing lots. But when they finally finished drawing lots and had chosen Saul, Saul was hiding among the supplies. And after they found him, Samuel presented him as king, told everyone the rights and duties of a king. Then he sent all the people home. About a month later, the Ammonites threatened an Israelite city, and when Saul heard about it, God's Spirit came upon him and he got good and angry. And he mobilized an army and slaughtered the Ammonites in a sneak attack. Next, he started fighting back against the Philistines and urging the people to rebel against them. He gathered an army, but Samuel was delayed and the men were growing restless. So Saul took it upon himself to offer the sacrifices. Samuel arrived just as he was finishing up and rebuked him, telling him that because he didn't keep God's commands, that God would choose someone else, a man after his own heart, to be the people's leader. Still, the Israelites won that battle and many subsequent battles against their enemies. Then one day Samuel came with a message from God for Saul. God had a score to settle with the Amalekites for attacking Israel after they left Egypt. So Saul was to attack and completely destroy them, including the livestock. But Saul and his soldiers brought back the king and the good livestock, only destroying what was worthless anyway. God told Samuel that he was sorry he'd ever made Saul king because Saul refused to obey him. And then God sent Samuel to confront him. Saul protested that he had obeyed. He'd killed everyone but the king, and they'd only brought the best of the animals to sacrifice to God. But Samuel told him obedience was better than sacrifice, and rebellion was as evil as witchcraft. And Samuel never met with Saul again, but he mourned God's rejection of Saul. Then one day God said to Samuel, "You've mourned long enough. Take some oil and go to Jesse's house in Bethlehem. I've chosen one of his sons to be king." Now Jesse was the grandson of Ruth and Boaz, and when Samuel met the family, he was sure that the oldest son Eliab was God's choice for the next king, because he looked like what a king should be. But God told Samuel he didn't judge by outward appearance, but he judged by what was in the heart. And Eliab was not God's choice for a king. It was the same for all 7 of Jesse's sons there. God hadn't chosen any of them. So Samuel asked if Jesse had any more sons, and Jesse said there was still his youngest, David, who was out in the fields watching the animals. Samuel had them send for David, and when David arrived, God told Samuel that David was his chosen king, And Samuel poured oil on him to anoint him as king. And from that day on, God's Spirit was upon David. Well, the Philistines invaded again, and Saul led the Israelite army out to meet them. The two armies camped on either side of a valley. In the Philistine camp, there was a champion, Goliath, who was over 9 feet tall. And every morning, Goliath would issue a challenge to the Israelites to choose a man to come fight him. And they could settle this with single combat. The side of the losing champion would be slaves to the winners. This went on for 40 days, and the Israelites were terrified, and no one would be their champion. Now Jesse's oldest sons were in the army, and one day Jesse sent David with provisions for them. And David was in the camp when Goliath came to issue his challenge that day. Well, David wanted to know why this Philistine was being allowed to defy God's army, and he started asking around about what someone would get for killing him. Eventually, Saul heard about this and summoned David. David volunteered to fight and was persuasive enough that Saul let him fight. So David went out to face the giant with nothing but his shepherd's staff, his slingshot, and 5 stones he'd picked up from a stream. The giant laughed at him, but David replied, "You attack with weapons, but I attack in the name of God, whose army you've insulted. Today he will conquer you, and I'll kill you and cut off your head. Then everyone will know that God is on Israel's side." David ran to meet him, putting 1 stone in his slingshot and letting it fly straight into the giant's forehead. The giant fell face down on the ground, and David took the giant's sword and cut off his head. The Philistines panicked and fled, and the Israelites chased them all the way home, then turned back and plundered the deserted camp. Saul had David brought to him and asked him about his father and his family. And after they'd finished talking, David met Saul's son Jonathan, and they were instant friends. They made a pact which Jonathan sealed by giving David his own clothes and weapons. And David was made a commander and a permanent part of Saul's army and wasn't allowed to return home. But on their way back from that battle, the women came out and sang this victory song, "Saul has killed thousands and David tens of thousands." And Saul was angry at being credited with less and became jealous of David. And that jealousy, combined with an evil spirit that tormented him, made life very touch and go for David when he wasn't out at war. He married Saul's daughter Michal, but Saul tried to kill him multiple times over the years. With Michal and Jonathan's help, David survived and was finally forced to go on the run. Saul pursued him and killed anyone he suspected of helping David, including priests. Twice David could have killed him, but David refused to harm God's anointed king. Instead, both times, David took something from next to the king and then called out to him to prove that he could have killed the king, but he wasn't going to. Finally, David went to stay among the Philistines in order to be safe from Saul. The Philistines gathered their armies to attack Israel again. Saul was terrified and tried to ask God what he should do, but God didn't answer. So he told his advisors to find a medium who could contact the spirit of Samuel, who had died, for him. When they found the medium, the spirit she summoned told Saul that God had left him and he was going to lose the battle against the Philistines. Meanwhile, over in the Philistine army, David had come to fight, but some of the Philistine commanders weren't too keen on having David with them, and he was sent back to where he was staying. Jonathan was killed in the battle, and Saul was desperately wounded and fell on his own sword rather than be captured and tortured by the Philistines. When news of their deaths reached David, he mourned them and wrote a funeral song. And David moved back to Judah and settled in Hebron, and the people of Judah made him their king. But one of Saul's surviving sons and Saul's general ruled over the tribes in the north. And there was civil war for years between them until Saul's son insulted that general badly enough that he went over to David's side and convinced all Israel to make David their king. But before that could be accomplished, both Saul's general and his son were murdered. And after this, the leaders of all the towns of Israel came to David and asked him to be their king as well. One of the first things David did as king was to conquer the city of Jerusalem and make it his capital. David was becoming stronger all the time because God was with him, and the king of Tyre sent messengers along with craftsmen and materials to build David a beautiful palace. The Philistines, on the other hand, kept mobilizing and attacking, But David defeated them every time because God was with him. After this, David took his men to fetch the Ark of the Covenant, and when they finally brought the Ark into Jerusalem, David celebrated with abandon. Not too long after that, David said to the prophet Nathan, "I'm living in this beautiful palace, but the Ark is in a tent." Nathan told him to do whatever he wanted because God was with him. But God had other ideas and told Nathan so that night. So the next day, Nathan delivered God's message to David. David wasn't the one to build a house for God. Instead, God was going to build David's house into a royal dynasty. And God would raise up David's son to be a great king, and he would build a house of worship for God. Upon hearing what God had to say, David prayed a prayer of worship and thanksgiving to God for all of God's blessings on him. Sometime later, the king of the Ammonites died, and David sent messengers to convey his condolences. But the new Ammonite king's advisors said that David wasn't sending messengers, but spies so that he could come and conquer them. The Ammonites humiliated David's messengers, shaving off half of their beards and cutting their robes so that their butts were exposed, and then sent them away. It didn't take too long for the Ammonites to realize what a bad idea that had been, and they hired foreign mercenaries to try to protect themselves from David's wrath. David sent the army out to meet them, and David's army defeated them so thoroughly that they surrendered, and the mercenaries were too afraid to fight against David's army again. So when spring rolled around and fighting could resume, David sent his army out against the Ammonites, and they laid siege to the Ammonite capital of Rabbah, while David remained in Jerusalem. One evening, David got up and went for a walk on the roof of his palace. And from there, he saw this gorgeous woman bathing, cleaning herself up after her monthly cycle. He found out that she was Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, one of his soldiers, who was away at war. And knowing this, he had her brought to his palace, slept with her, and then she returned home. But some weeks later, Bathsheba sent word to David that she was pregnant. So David had Uriah sent back to the city, and after asking him about how the siege was going, David told him to go home, relax, see his wife. But Uriah didn't go home. He stayed and slept alongside the palace guard at the palace. So the next day, David asked Uriah why he didn't go home. And Uriah said it wouldn't be right for him to go home and enjoy himself while the ark and all his fellow soldiers were out on the battlefield. So David invited Uriah for dinner and got him drunk. But even then Uriah wouldn't go home. The next morning, David gave Uriah a message for Joab. A message that basically said, "Have Uriah killed in battle." Totally forgot to mention that Joab was David's general, but he was. So Joab did as instructed, and Bathsheba mourned her husband's death. When her time of mourning was over, David sent for her and made her one of his wives. But God was not okay with this. So after their son was born, God sent the prophet Nathan to confront David. And Nathan told David a story about two men who lived next door to each other, one very rich with many animals, and one who had only one lamb that was more a very loved pet that was part of his family than livestock to him. And one day, when the rich man had guests, he didn't serve one of his own animals for dinner, but took the pet lamb from the poor man and served it to his guests. David was furious and said that man deserved to die, and he must pay 4 lambs to the poor man to pay for the one he stole. And Nathan told David that he was the man, for he who had many wives and so many blessings from God had shown utter contempt for God's law by murdering Uriah and taking his wife. Because David had done this, his own household would rebel against him. David confessed his great sin, and Nathan told him that God had forgiven him and he wouldn't die, but Bathsheba's baby would die. When Nathan left, the baby became seriously ill. David started fasting and praying for God to spare the child. He didn't eat, and he laid on bare ground for a week. Then the child died. And his advisors were really worried about what he would do when they told him the child was dead. But upon finding out the child had died, David got cleaned up, went to the tabernacle and worshiped God, then came back and ate a meal. His advisors couldn't understand it. But he explained to them that while the child was alive, He hoped that God would be merciful and spare the child. But now that the child was dead, there was nothing David could do to bring the child back to life. And David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and she became pregnant with another son, who they named Solomon. Things kind of fell apart in David's family after that. His oldest son, Amnon, became totally obsessed with his half-sister and raped her, and then sent her away. And her full brother, Absalom, hated Amnon for what he had done, and a couple years later had him murdered in the middle of a feast that Absalom was hosting. And then Absalom had to go into exile after that, and when he was finally welcomed back home, he spent the next 4 years stealing the affection of the people from his father and plotting to steal the kingdom. When Absalom launched his rebellion, David was forced to flee Jerusalem, but his army was loyal, and they finally killed Absalom, and David stayed king. And when David was very old, his next oldest son, Adonijah, tried to nab the crown for himself. But David had already sworn to Bathsheba that Solomon would be the next king. So Solomon was anointed as king in a very rushed ceremony, and when shortly after David died, Adonijah made another attempt for the throne, Solomon had him killed as well. Early in Solomon's reign, God appeared to him in a dream and told him to ask for whatever he wanted. Solomon asked for wisdom to lead the people well, and God was so pleased that he not only granted Solomon's request, but he also said he'd give him what he hadn't asked for, riches and fame, such that there would be no king that compared with him during his lifetime. That wisdom was most famously put to the test when 2 prostitutes who lived in the same house came to him because one of their babies had died during the night, and they both claimed that the living child was theirs. Solomon proposed cutting the live child in half, and when only one woman protested that decision, saying she would rather have the child alive and belonging to the other woman, Solomon knew which was really the mother. Solomon's reign was quite peaceful, so there isn't much to tell. Mostly he did a lot of building. He built the temple according to the design of the tabernacle. He built a beautiful palace for himself and his many wives. And eventually, in his old age, he built shrines for the gods of his foreign wives so they could worship their gods. And he was persuaded to worship these foreign gods as well. God was angry about this and told Solomon he was going to tear the kingdom away from his line and give it to one of Solomon's servants. But for David's sake and the promise God had made to him, at least one tribe would remain loyal to Solomon's son. Now, one other thing that should be mentioned about David and Solomon is that they were prolific writers for their time. David wrote many of the Psalms. Remembering his shepherd days and God's care for him, he wrote, "The Lord is my shepherd, so I have everything I need." When he was on the run from Saul, he wrote, "Come with great power, O God, and rescue me. Defend me with your might." After Nathan confronted him about Bathsheba, he wrote, "Create in me a clean heart, O God. Renew a loyal spirit within me. Don't banish me from your presence, and don't take your Holy Spirit from me." And when he was on the run from Absalom, he wrote, "You, O Lord, are a shield around me. You are my glory, the one who holds my head high." Solomon expressed his wisdom through the Proverbs in the book of Proverbs, but it seems like it took him his whole life to learn that the best way to find meaning when surrounded by the meaninglessness of life is to remember and honor God when you are young. And this message he wrote in the book of Ecclesiastes. Solomon lived to be an old man and died in Jerusalem. Now that the story's over, it's time for our processing questions. So, here are our processing questions. Feel free to think through them yourself, or if you're listening to this with a group, pause the audio and talk amongst yourselves about these. What did you like about this story? What did you not like or find confusing and uncomfortable in this story? What did you learn about God from this story? What did you learn about people from this story? And what does God want you to do in light of this story? Now, there's just one last thing before you go, and that is if you are enjoying this series and you find it beneficial, I'd really appreciate it if you would like, subscribe, and share this with your friends. And I will catch you on the next episode of Bible Briefs.